Hello and welcome to this broadcast by Brexit Watch. I'm your host, Jonathan Saxty. Well, today we are really delighted to welcome our chairman, Ben Habib. Ben is an entrepreneur, the founder and CEO of the award-winning First Property Group. A long-standing critic of the European Union, Ben was a member of the European Parliament for the Brexit Party. Ben, it seems strange to say this to our own chairman, but welcome to Brexit Watch.
Thank you very much, Jonathan.
Now, before we get into the nuts and bolts of our discussion, I'd like to wish you and your family well during this unprecedented crisis. Can I begin by asking, Ben, how the coronavirus crisis has personally impacted you and your work over the last few months?
Well, from a personal perspective, I'm very fortunate and it hasn't had a material adverse effect on my life. My staff in my office is basically working from home. So I've been able to go for my runs in the morning, go home, do some weights. So I used to go to the gym. I now do that at home. And then I've actually cycled into my office where I've been on my own all day. I'm CEO of the business, so someone needs to be here to make payments, sign documents, and keep the ship moving forward. And yeah. I've basically had a very normal life, with the exception of not being able to go out to restaurants or pubs, as is part of sort of London life. But apart from that, I've actually had quite a normal existence. I can't complain.
Now, sticking with the crisis, Ben, how would you assess so far the government's handling of this coronavirus crisis, both in a public health sense and crucially in an economic one?
Yeah, well, it's very easy to be critical of the government, and I could sit here and talk about their lack of preparedness with PPE, their lack of forewarning through the Cygnus report that they had in 2016, and their lack of reaction to that, the lack of surplus capacity in the NHS, and I could reel off all these things. But I think it's only fair to say that in a democracy such as ours, you're unlikely to be prepared for these high impact but very low probability events like the pandemic that suddenly came out of the blue. So I'd like to be charitable, at least at the starting point of where the Prime Minister and his government found himself in sort of February and early March. But I think their handling of the health issue has been wrong in one major respect, and that is we all knew at the outset that actually this pandemic hits the elderly and those with pre-existing conditions much harder than it hits younger people. That was known. There was very little known about the virus, but that was known at the outset. And I think the government's greatest failing was its failure to protect the elderly and to isolate those with pre-existing conditions, so that in focusing on the NHS, it should also have moved to protect the care homes. And if it had done that, I think we'd have a much lesser, we'd have many fewer deaths. The death toll would look, healthier in relation to our other European countries who are our direct comparators. And I think we would probably therefore have a more confident government now and a more confident nation and be more prepared to go back to work. And I think the other big failing in the government's handling of the healthcare crisis is in communicating to people that actually it is just the elderly and those with pre-existing conditions who are vulnerable. We now have teacher unions advising teachers not to go back to work. And I'm sure part of that is a failure to understand that the vast majority of those working in the teaching profession are not at risk of going back to work with, primary school students or whatever age it is that the government wants to open up at this particular stage. And so it's a failure, I think, of those two things that really get me on the health side.
And obviously on the economic side, we've had a lot of measures unleashed by the Chancellor. What do you think of the government response on the economic front? Is it enough? Was it the right approach?
Yeah, well, I can't justify in my own mind locking down economies. It's something that I can't understand what would motivate a government to lock down an economy other than panic. And I think that's what set in when they were presented with that now infamous Imperial College report that forecast 500,000 deaths in the United Kingdom if they took no action. I think the government panicked and it shut everything down. And when they shut it down, I was kind of holding my head in my hands thinking, my goodness, how do they get out of this political cul-de-sac now? Because the minute they did that, any loosening of the lockdown would always be regarded by those who feared most as a trade-off between the economy and lives. And you can't put a monetary value on lives.
No.
And again, I come back to the fact that if they actually protected the elderly and those with pre-existing conditions, then they wouldn't have had to take the draconian step of locking the economy down. But anyway, they panicked, and they weren't alone in panicking. Lots of other governments panicked at the same time and took the same steps, and no doubt they were influenced by what other governments were doing.
Yeah. And
so having panicked and having locked down the economy, I think some of the steps taken by Rishi Sunak were brilliant. I think it was absolutely right to have a furlough scheme to underpin people's income. I think it was absolutely right to have the coronavirus business loans for small businesses, to free up the money markets for larger businesses who've got credit ratings. Absolutely right to look after medium-sized businesses. I think they're a bit slow to look after, owner-operators of businesses. SMEs were a bit neglected to start with, but I think that, then they came forward with some policies for them as well. So I think Rishi's done the best he can of a bad job. But now they're well behind the curve, having failed to protect the elderly, having had to deal with the public opinion consequences of a very large death toll. They're on their back foot, and they've extended the furlough scheme. And I think that was a mistake. What we now need is for people to be given an incentive to go back to work. And to extend the furlough scheme to October is basically incentivizing people to stay at home. And that's the wrong incentive. We now need people to be coming back to work. I've used public transport to come into central London this morning, and the tube was completely empty. So even though we've had some easing of the lockdown, people are not coming back to work. And we now need government initiatives to incentivize people to come back to work, and extending the furlough scheme was a mistake. And I think we're in real danger of being left behind. And one of the reasons the teacher unions are against going back to work and is because they're acting rationally. Why would you tell your teachers to go out of their homes where they're safe, earn perhaps a little bit more money, but have all the hassle of going to work and have all the risks of potentially catching the disease? And they haven't had it properly communicated to them that actually the chances of them suffering are very, very low. I think the percentage deaths in the under 45 age group is 0.018%. I mean, it's, I wouldn't say it's negligible, but it's very, very small. And so with the furlough scheme, the incentive is the wrong way. And with the messaging not being quite, on the mark, you've now got a very nervous nation, and getting us back to work is going to be very, very difficult.
Ben, you touched on the global element, and of course, every country has gone down this avenue. I was speaking with somebody yesterday in Australia, and we were talking about the fact that New Zealand and Australia are sort of a little bit more out of the woods than we are. But of course, the problem is if a country gets out of the woods, then unless and until their trading partners are, if you like, back online, they are sort of, their economy is still stuck in second gear. Factoring that in, and given what you've said, what do you see as some of the at least medium-term consequences of this lockdown economically?
Well, I think the economic consequences are disastrous. Thankfully, we're not part of the European Union, and perhaps we'll talk about that later. So we do have a central bank that can act genuinely as a central bank.
Yes.
And that does mean that the Bank of England can print as much money as is required to fund our government and ensure that our government doesn't default on its debt. The only problem with that approach is whether or not, or the risk with that approach is whether or not the international investing community loses confidence in the United Kingdom. And if that results in the pound sliding dramatically, which would obviously push up inflation, and which would make it very hard for the Bank of England, for the government to fund its future borrowing needs. I think at the moment, frankly, Rishi can print as much cash as he needs to get us out of a hole, because the US is doing it, because the Europeans are doing it, because Japan is doing it. The world is basically printing cash. So the investment community's eyes are not firmly focused on the downsides of the British economy. And if I were Rishi, I would be printing more cash than I need. I'd be raising more money than the government needs. And I'd be really fortifying my financial resources while no one's looking at the overall government debt level in the normal way that they do. So that I had enough cash to fund all my new schemes that I put in place to mitigate some of the adverse consequences of the lockdown. And enough cash after that to do the levelling up of the United Kingdom, which the Prime Minister promised during the general election campaign. Of course, the danger in that, Jonathan, as I'm sure you're aware, is that the government raises all this money, but actually squanders it. You know, government hasn't got a good track record in using money that it's got in its coffers for good purpose. But that's what I would be doing. I'd be raising more money than I need, and I'd be holding it dry to ensure that I can then deliver the growth agenda that this country needs post the end of the lockdown, so that I don't need to raise taxes, so I don't need austerity. Austerity didn't work. I understand why George Osborne was motivated by it in 2010, and you can forgive him for wanting to balance the books in a traditional conservative way. But actually, we were in a new economic paradigm back in 2010. He didn't recognize it, and it hasn't been recognized. I hope it is now recognized that we are in this new economic paradigm. And part of that economic paradigm does involve very large government debt. And it would be a mistake to try to use austerity to get us out of this very large public debt position. What we need to do is ensure that we have a pro-growth government agenda coming out of the lockdown, and that we trade our way out of this debt, that our GDP grows, that we have a dynamic economy, and that government debt as a proportion of GDP then becomes a smaller proportion.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, Ben. I mean, it's interesting to think of some of the positive things which may come out of this. It's difficult in the midst of all this. I mean, a lot of people, obviously, you know, half of the workforce, if not more, is working from home. Study after study has shown that home working can make people more productive. Perhaps that's accelerated a trend which was already beginning. Obviously, there has been a lot of criticism leveled at China, and perhaps a concern that the Western world has become over-dependent on Chinese industry. Perhaps that could catalyze a new industrial renaissance in the Western world. We've seen 3D printing a little bit come into its own during this crisis. What do you think some of the more perhaps long-term positive consequences, if any, may be of this crisis?
Yeah, well, I think a light has already been shone on the failure of this country to reinvent itself as a world-class leading manufacturer and cutting-edge industry. You know, by nature, I'm a Thatcherite because I grew up with Maggie Thatcher as Prime Minister, and a lot of the stuff that she did, I think, was absolutely spot on. But one thing she failed to do was to reinvent the north of England and those parts of the United Kingdom which were adversely affected by the shutdown of our traditional manufacturing businesses. And this crisis is shone of, we've had a light shone on that anyway for the last few years, but this crisis has really brought it to the fore, our inability to produce the number of tests that we need in the country in the way that Germany could, because it actually had the manufacturing base to produce the tests. Similarly with South Korea. So, you know, I hope that the government will learn from those lessons, and that some of the cash that they raise will be used to, engender cutting-edge industries, making sure that the United Kingdom also has strategically important manufacturing capability at home.
Yeah.
And that doesn't just apply to cutting-edge industries, where I think they should focus, but it applies to basic industries like steel manufacturing.
Yeah.
Do we really want to be reliant on China for accessing our steel? It's a key component of any country's ability to build anything. So I hope that the government's looking at that and producing a plan for what post-pandemic post-Brexit, post-pandemic United Kingdom will be, and bringing some of those, onshoring some of those manufacturing processes, de-risking some of the supply chains which are of an international nature, particularly moving away from dependence on China for our goods. I've got nothing against the Chinese people, but the government clearly needs to be held to account for what it's been up to, and I don't like the creeping control of China across the globe. I see their move towards providing PPE to certain countries as almost sinister rather than helpful. That's my kind of take on it.
How do you think relations between the West and China may fall sour over the next year or two?
Well, I think we need to have a very hard-nosed look at our dependence on Chinese goods and how they're manufactured, where they come from. And ensure that, first of all, we're not damaging our own industries as a result of our dependence on China, that we're not putting the United Kingdom at risk as a result of our dependence on China, and that to the extent that we trade with China, we make sure that China ups its game. So, proper human rights applied in China, proper animal rights applied in China. They've got to stop these wet markets and the production of these creating environments for the production of these viruses. I think the 2 out of the last 3 major virus scares have come out of China. So we've had a lot of red lights flashing at us, and we've got to have a cold, hard-nosed look at it. For some reason, it's the sort of liberal side of the United Kingdom that's become quite pro-Chinese, even though they're a totalitarian regime, and it's the sort of right of center libertarians who are now looking at China saying they need to be held to account, and I really hope that side of the debate prevails in having this audit of our relationship with China.
Before we leave the coronavirus and naturally go on to Brexit, what, if any, are going to be the political implications for the UK, do you think, in the next couple of years of this crisis? You mentioned the government's ambition to level up. I mean, has this just thrown the government's agenda completely off balance, or do you think they can get back on track after this?
Well, I think that the government is potentially off balance. I think the government is off balance at the moment. They wanted herd immunity. I'm just going to, at the risk of repeating myself, Jonathan, for a second, they initially wanted herd immunity, then they went for the suppression model, and denying that testing, tracing and tracking was needed, keeping our airports open. And now, quite late in the day, they're suddenly testing, tracking and tracing, quarantining people coming into the country for 14 days, pretty much after the horses bolted. And you get a sense of a government slightly they were in panic to start with, but in continued panic. And they need to calm down, and they need to take a proper assessment of the landscape and look back at their manifesto pledges and determine how they get from where they are now to delivering their manifesto pledges. The sign of a great government, the sign of a really great government, is not giving up on its promises when the going gets tough, but finding mechanisms by which to deliver its promises, notwithstanding the fact that the going has got tough. And whether the Prime Minister is of a Churchillian mould or not will be determined, I think, in whether he can deliver his manifesto pledges. So I come back to the fact that coming out of this pandemic, We must not have that knee-jerk reaction of tax everyone to the hilt, complete austerity to try and balance the books, and do what George Osborne did, which was condemn the United Kingdom to 10 years of mediocre growth. What we've got to do is the government's got to fill its boots with cash now, while the investment community is not looking at it. It needs to be ready for a pro-growth exit from the pandemic. It needs to deliver its levelling up agenda, which is not just for the north of England, but for Ireland, for parts of Scotland, for Wales, and for London. There are lots of parts of London that need a great amount of investment, notwithstanding how rich London is in certain pockets. And it needs to have and it also needs to have a supply side rebooting of the economy. So we need to actually cut taxes. Coming out of the European Union is a great opportunity to do that. We need to cut regulations, and we need to boost the supply side of our economy so that we can flourish.
Yeah, the business of Britain should be business then, I think. Now, leaving coronavirus for the time being, let's move on to Brexit now. Yeah. Obviously, we are currently in this transition period, due to end at the end of the year. During this transition period, the UK is in the single market and the customs union, but no longer has representation in Brussels. MEPs like you were sent packing after Brexit. What do you think of the state of play of these negotiations? We hear reports in the press that there have been disagreements. There have been sort of not particularly pleasant words exchanged on both sides recently. How would you characterize the state of negotiations right now?
Well, I'm very encouraged by the stance that Frost has taken with the European Union. It's high time that the British government stood up for the United Kingdom. The withdrawal agreement that we signed at the end of January in order to get us out of the European Union is, in my own words, worse than remaining in the European Union. That's what I said, when I was examining that agreement back in December, and I stand by it. And so it requires a government prepared to repudiate the Northern Irish Protocol or to unpick it, which effectively leaves Northern Ireland behind under European Union Court of Justice hegemony, European Union state aid laws, and of course the awful border down the Irish Sea. And whatever the Prime Minister might say, actually, in order to give effect to implement the Northern Irish Protocol faithfully, checks will be required on both sides of the Irish Sea. And so we have to unpick that Northern Irish Protocol. The other thing that we must do is not give in to the pressure for a level playing field, i.e. to sign the United Kingdom up any further to EU state aid laws, competition law, environmental law, and competition law, as well as tax matters. We've got to be able to throw all that red tape out. And it seems that the rhetoric is in the right direction. So unless the European Union relents in its position, which I think is an egregious position, frankly, in the way that they make demands of us, unless they relent, I think the government needs to be prepared to leave on what it now calls Aussie terms or WTO terms, and get on with it. One of the things that concerns me, and I loathe to play the man rather than the ball. One of the things that concerns me, though, is that Michael Gove is in charge of no deal planning, and Michael Gove is on the record a number of times saying that no deal is a really bad deal for the United Kingdom, and I wholly disagree with him. Actually, I think managed properly, no deal is potentially one of the best outcomes for the United Kingdom, because it breaks us unequivocally away from the sclerotic, over-regulated financial disaster that the European Union is. And I hope Michael Gove, notwithstanding his personal views, is properly preparing a no-deal plan. And I don't mean just making sure that we've got the requisite border force in place to deal with customs declarations, etc. what I mean is a really positive vision for the United Kingdom. And again, I'm going to repeat myself a bit, but, you know, with a no deal situation, we would be able to, and we should, cut corporation tax, cut VAT, have a pro-growth agenda, get rid of this notion that government debt in the European Union should be at zero risk so that our city can properly price it. We should be able to set our own agenda as a country without any of those fetters, and we should become the low regulation, low taxed European equivalent of Singapore. We'll never be a Singapore, but we should be the European equivalent of the Singapore, and take the economic fight to the European Union. They fear us being deregulated, low tax entity, and that's precisely why we must become that entity. And actually, if I were writing this business plan, I would also impose tariffs on the EU goods coming to the United Kingdom. We run a €100 billion deficit with the EU, and we would make a surplus of around 8 billion a year in tariffs, and we should have that for the benefit of the British taxpayer and for the protection of our own producers. You know, if we levy tariffs on them, actually it makes it easier for our producers to manufacture product locally at home. And I think we should have an unequivocal Buy British campaign. We should eject all the European Union regulations associated with procurement. I mean, why should our government have to tender equally with European Union companies? Absolutely not. We should give British companies a preference in doing that. And of course, with a clean break Brexit, we immediately get all the benefits of saving that 12 billion a year that we're paying them too. And frankly, I would have gone on with it already.
You mentioned Singapore, Ben. I mean, of course, Singapore is, you know, like in many respects, it does have a big industry. I think 25% of their economy is industry, and the government of Singapore does put Singapore first. Yeah. So it's certainly no contradiction there. Now, we've heard calls from some in the SNP, some of the Labour Party, people who support Remain, that we should extend this transition. As I said, the transition due to end at the end of the year. Next month will come I think that's the moment where a decision has to be made about extending. The argument is made that, well, you know, all shoulders are to the wheel on the coronavirus crisis. Resources have been diverted. There's no way we can commit the resources needed to getting a good deal for the UK. And of course, already the world is taking a big economic hit. Why add to it? That's the call. What do you say to those people then who think the UK and the EU should extend the transition period by 1 year, 2 years, or however many years?
Well, I think all the arguments made by those advocating extension are disingenuous. There is absolutely no need for an extension. And indeed, I think that it undermines the democratic principle completely. You know, we've had, just dealing with the democracy issue to start with, you know, we had the referendum on the 23rd of June, 2016. It's now coming up to 4 years since the British people said get out, and we're still in the single market, still in the customs union. Right. It seems unconscionable to me. 3 national elections after the referendum, all of which were won by pro-leave agendas, including, of course, most pertinently, the current government's position to get us out by 31st December 2020. It seems unconscionable to me that another breach of that democratic promise would take place. But leave that aside, because the Remainers like to argue everything on economic principles rather than democratic ones. From an economic perspective, I think it would be an utter disaster to stay in with them. And the reasons are manifold. First and foremost, we need to get out of the regulatory sclerotic setup that the European Union is. And we can only do that and do all the supply side reform that I was mentioning if we get out, and we get out cleanly. We've got to be able to support our industries. We've got to be able to cut regulations for our industries. We've got to be able to cut taxes for our industries. We can't do that if we sign up to some kind of level playing field. And the longer we stay in the transition period, the longer we're delaying our ability to do that. First, so that's the principal economic argument. But secondarily, and only marginally secondarily, the European Union is imploding at the moment. Most particularly, the Eurozone is imploding. Italy is on the verge of going bust. Spain is on the verge of going bust. In all technical terms, actually, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and France are bust. They're being bailed out by the European Central Bank at the moment. But there's a limit to how much the European Central Bank can do, because it's not a traditional central bank like the Bank of England. Its hands are tied. It can't go beyond a certain amount of quantitative easing, and it can't collectively write off debts. You know, the Bank of England being owed money by the government is effectively a circular arrangement. No one really owes anyone anything. But that's not the case in Europe. The Italians, when the ECB buys Italian government debt, the Italian government really does owe that money still to the ECB. And the Germans and the Dutch will not allow that debt to be forgiven. In fact, there was a constitutional court ruling in Germany, was it last week or 10 days ago, which prohibited the ECB from doing any more QE of that nature. It says it ruled that the ECJ had acted in an ultra vires manner, as had done the ECB. So they are about to have a series. Sorry.
Just to interrupt there, just that point, I think it's interesting to go into that in a bit more detail. What do you think the implications are of the constitutional court ruling in Germany?
Well, I think the implications are vast. Firstly, the Constitutional Court has effectively rebelled against the European Union treaties, which put the European Court of Justice as the senior most court in the European Union. It's looked at what the ECB has been up to. It's looked at what the sanction that the European Court of Justice gave the ECB and said, no, actually, you've trampled on the treaties and you have trampled on the German state in approving that quantitative easing, and we prohibit you from doing it. From a European Union perspective, it's nothing short of a rebellion from one of its member states. It's like a rebellion in an empire. And it's actually the rebellions coming from the richest, most significant member of the European Union. So I think it's one hell of a wake-up call for the European Union. And from a financial perspective, it absolutely puts the likelihood of a sovereign, it moves the likelihood of a sovereign debt crisis, a series of sovereign debt crises in Europe, from a 75% probability to a 99% probability. And I think it's going to happen in the latter half of this year. And I hope, again, that as part of our planning to get out of the European Union, our government is putting in place measures to mitigate the financial fallout that's going to be coming from the European Union. You know, one of the drawbacks with the withdrawal agreement is that the government has still left us on the hook for a joint and several guarantee of the European Investment Bank's liabilities. Now, that is a 500 billion euro potential bill.
Yeah. We
share that bill with Germany and I think it's 17 countries that have provided guarantees, to the European Investment Bank. But it's a joint and several guarantee. That means that if one of them doesn't pay because they're bust, the United Kingdom has to pay.
Yeah.
And so potentially it's another 500 billion bill. And, that's the last thing we should be entertaining at the moment. So we need to get out of the European Union for our own sake, so that the government can look after the United Kingdom and deliver its promises and make sure that the UK has a bright future. But we also need to get out because the European Union is an economic basket case. And I hope that we're preparing to mitigate any of the fallout that will come from that basket case imploding.
If these sovereign debt crises take place, the Eurozone
Sorry, could you repeat that, Jonathan? You cut out there for a second.
Sorry, I said if the sovereign debt crises in the Eurozone transpired, do you think that would be the final nail in the coffin for the Eurozone and the EU, or would they muddle through somehow until the next crisis?
Well, it's very interesting. After the Karlsruhe court ruling, the Constitutional Court in Germany's ruling, I thought that was it. But Merkel and Macron in the last couple of days have hatched a plan for the European Union to itself borrow 500 billion.
500 billion, yeah.
500 billion seems to be a kind of number that they like in the EU.
Yeah.
it's just a coincidence that it happens to be the same value of the liabilities of the European Investment Bank. But anyway, they've now concocted this plan for the European Union to borrow over 500 billion, which, by the way, is a breach of the EU treaties. Article 311, you can look it up, of the functioning of the European Union treaty. Article 311 prohibits the European Union from borrowing money. But notwithstanding that prohibition, the French and the Germans have dreamed up this plan, to which the Dutch, the Austrians, and a few other countries have responded with great sort of eyebrow raising and hand wringing, and they're far from pleased from it. And I imagine that the German people are far from pleased with that step.
Because it's in the form of grants, isn't it, rather than the form of loans?
Absolutely. And it's going to be the German people, the Dutch and the Austrians and so on, who are going to be picking up the tab. Yeah. And it's nothing short of a political workaround the German Constitutional Court's ruling. Yeah. They're effectively saying, fine, the German courts have ruled that, but we're going to ignore you, and we're going to do this through political means. Yeah. And they may prevail. They may prevail. And what that will mean is that we're going to be rapidly heading towards fiscal union in the Eurozone. And we're going to have more Europe. Yeah. And they may somehow then solve or mitigate or do what they do so well, which is kick the can down the road with the sovereign debt crises. But what you're going to increasingly have is this sclerotic, economically unviable, third-rate trading bloc, which is the Eurozone and the European Union. And even if they succeed in keeping this zombie going, we need to get out.
I think certainly I've been saying for some time that this could be used as an excuse, this whole crisis, and the fact that national politicians in Europe have had to answer to national elections will be used as an excuse for yet more Europe. The issue here with the Eurozone, it has a currency union, but no demos. That's why the Germans are not willing to bail out the Italians. It's not comparable to say a proper country like the UK or the US, where one state in the US, say California, will say, okay, fine, we will subsidise Alabama. England will say same for Wales. That's not the sentiment in Europe, and that is at the heart of the problem.
That is the heart of the problem. The German people, in fact, have never voted ever to bail out Italy. On what manifesto, what part of Merkel's manifesto or Macron's manifesto suggests that they're going to be putting money in to bail out other countries? In fact, it's explicitly prohibited, and yet they're doing it. Yeah. And we've just got to get out. We've got to get out.
Yeah. And we've also seen, obviously, with this Corona bonds sort of debacle, and I think this is just another manifestation of this, as you say, muddling through, kicking the can down the road, as it were. So, and actually, just one more thing I think of, Southern Europe is probably going to face a big hit. It usually has a big summer tourism trade. We can assume that aviation and tourism, which globally I think is just over 12% of the world economy, that's going to be in the tank for some time. That's going to be an enormous hit this summer. I know they're saying that they are going to try and get through it, but it seems hard to imagine how you're going to enforce social distancing in bars in Mallorca, for one. And of course, today came through the news, 9,000 more jobs cut at Rolls-Royce. Aerospace sectors experiencing a hit that is going to continue. We can assume the automobile sector, which Germany is colossal, that's going to continue to take a big hit. So the Southern Europeans, may not be able to look to the Northern Europeans for a bailout in any event.
Yeah, there may not be the money there. Absolutely. Yeah. We've all talked about the big spending packages that these countries are doing, but they're going to be doing them at the same time as their GDP is shrinking, which is the point you're making. And so it's a double whammy for them. Yeah. And the United Kingdom, for whatever it is, for all the self-criticism that we have of ourselves, for all our own inadequacies and everything else, we're actually a damn good nation at getting on and sorting out our own problems and reinventing ourselves and moving forward. And we've got a terrific country. We've got a terrific city. We've got terrific people, and we've got to get on and look after ourselves and put Britain first and have a pro-growth agenda for the United Kingdom, have an optimistic agenda from the United Kingdom, and break away from this basket case.
Yeah, I've often written about the fact we have the best higher education system in the world.
Absolutely.
States. We don't have that resource anywhere like as much as we could. And of course, there is this union that is currently being spoken of, CANZUK. It's standing for Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK. And the idea being the UK post Brexit can get back into bed with its Commonwealth siblings. What do you see as the potential for trade, not just with the Commonwealth, but with the US and other countries? Obviously, Liz Truss and Robert Lighthizer are currently leading negotiations on behalf of the UK and the US for trade talks. What do you see, Ben, as the potential for trade with the Commonwealth, with the United States, with other countries like Japan after both Brexit and obviously after the coronavirus?
Yeah, well, I think the potential is vast. And as we saw in the last 24 hours, our government has already suggested that it's going to cut tariffs on some of these countries where we've been forced to levy fairly high tariffs because of, being part of the single market. Come 1st January 2021, we're going to be cutting tariffs with or without trade agreements with these people. And of course, that's terrific for the United Kingdom because, first of all, it engenders further trade with these countries, but it lowers the cost of our living in this country. There are two ways for people to get richer. You either grow wages and wealth or you cut cost of living. And to get rid of the tariffs that the EU was imposing is a big step forward for the UK. And I think that they will be delighted. We are one of the biggest consumers in the world, and these countries recognize and value the fact that we are their clients. The European Union doesn't seem to value the 100 billion deficit that we have with them, or the surplus that they have with us. The great thing about the US, by the way, and I think we will get a good trade deal with the US, particularly if President Trump is re-elected. But the great thing about the US is that they think they're running a trade surplus with us, and we think we run a trade surplus with them. For some anomalous reason, the way the numbers are struck, we both think we're getting the better end of trade. And so that sets up a fantastic atmosphere for cooperation and getting a trade deal with the US. And they're our biggest trading, they're the single biggest trading partner we've got.
And Ben, before we leave Brexit, let's just revisit the idea of delay for a second and where negotiations are. A bit of a cheeky question, and I'm going to put it quite bluntly. Do you trust the Conservatives?
I'm 54 years old. I've been in private business for 20 odd years. I've always traveled in hope, and I've always prepared for the worst. And so from an emotional perspective, I'm hoping that they do what they say they will. But there's a little voice in my head that keeps telling me I'm not 100% confident. And I think part of that is, the way Mrs. May handled everything. You've got to remember it's been the Conservatives who've had the ability, who have been charged with the responsibility to deliver Brexit. And it's the Conservatives who've repeatedly failed to do it. So I'm traveling in hope, and I'm emotionally preparing for the worst. And I'm doing my very best, Jonathan, through interviews with people such as yourself and writing articles and so on. I'm doing my very best to reveal what the government should be doing in order to get the best deal for the United Kingdom. And I'm hoping and praying that they're reading some of what I write and listening to some of what I say and making note.
And if a delay takes place, do you think there will be a role then for the Brexit Party?
Absolutely. I think people are still... People have been triggered by Brexit. People who hitherto have been perhaps politically aware but entirely politically inactive are now politically active. And I think a delay will be like a tsunami of political opinion swing in the country. What we're going to have in October, Jonathan, in the United Kingdom is a very severe recession,
Yeah.
the end of furloughing,
Yeah.
and the beginning of a very serious rise in unemployment. That is going to happen whatever steps the government now takes.
Yeah.
And if that is accompanied by a delay in Brexit, I don't think the government will win the next election. He may have an 80-seat majority, but people are much more promiscuous with their votes now than they were before. And that 80-seat majority may just evaporate on, if we have the kind of recession which Rishi Sunak thinks we're going to have, and I think we're going to have, and they extend this wretched transition period, they would have breached their manifesto, fundamentally breached their manifesto promises. The British people are politically engaged. They will recognize that. There'll be a massive swing, and the Prime Minister would need to then watch out.
And applying everything we've spoken about today, spoken about coronavirus, Brexit, the state of play in the EU, and a little bit about the Conservative Party. If you had one big prediction for the rest of the year, for maybe the next 6 to 12 months, it could be economic, could be political, what would that one big prediction or forecast be?
It's sort of obvious, Jonathan. I think we're going to have the mother of all recessions. We're going to have the mother of all recessions. It's going to make 2008 look like a walk in the park. We're in the phony war at the moment because the furlough scheme and the bounce back loans and everyone's staying at home. People haven't really felt how awful it's going to be, but they're going to feel that in October. And I'm at risk of repeating myself, but I hope that the government is raising enough money so that it can go through that difficult period with a pro-growth agenda, pro-employment agenda, supply-side reform, deregulating, cutting taxes, getting Britain onto the front foot, and making us a competitive fighting force from a commercial perspective.
Yeah, so the phoenix can rise from the ashes.
Absolutely. The United Kingdom, there's absolutely no reason why the UK should not come out of this head and shoulders above Europe. There's absolutely no reason. If we fail to do that, it'll be a monumental failure in government policy.
Well, on that note, I think that's a good note on which to end, a good, positive, strong note on which to end. So thank you, Ben, as chairman at Brexit Watch. Thank you for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jonathan.
And thank you for watching. You can find out more at www.brexit-watch.org. You can also find us on Facebook and on Twitter. Until next time.